My name is Andy Hargreaves. I was born and raised, like Ken Robinson, in the north of England, and I'm now a professor in the University of Ottawa, speaking in the middle of our Canadian winter, as you can see behind me. And I'm truly honoured to be part of this extraordinary online memorial event for Sir Ken Robinson to remember his life, his work, his impact, and his legacy. A few years ago, with a couple of colleagues, Alma Harris from Wales and Alan Boyle, another fellow Liverpudlian of Ken's, I wrote a book called Uplifting Leadership. It was based on a study of unusually high-performing organisations in circumstances you'd least expect, ones that did a lot with a little, ones that turned around after poor performance, ones that started up from nothing and then kept going afterwards. We studied organisations like Fiat Auto before it became Fiat Chrysler, like Burnley Football Club in the English Premier League, the smallest town ever to enter the English Premier League of football. And Ken would probably be delighted as an Evertonian that, of course, this season it was the first in over 60 games to score a victory over Liverpool at Liverpool's home ground. What we learned about these organisations, which included businesses, sports teams, and schools and local authorities, school districts as well, that what was it that made them particularly high performing? Well, there were various things that we all know well: having a strong and bold vision, bringing a team together of diverse people who could help you achieve it. And one thing that really stood out was doing the opposite of what other people did or expected, going in the other direction, swimming against the stream, cutting against the grain. And this really is what Ken Robinson's life has been about. Extraordinary achievement and accomplishment from circumstances where you might least expect it. And there's a lot we can all learn from this, being inspired by his life and his legacy. For example, imagine if you were born and raised in a working class family in the north of England in the 1950s and 60s, one of 7 children with very little money. And you should find yourself not only going on to university, but also moving on into a stellar career and becoming one of the most famous people in education, not just in my generation, but for all time. And a real intellectual and strategic legacy of the importance of creativity and imagination and the arts in the work of our schools and our other organisations as well. Imagine if you were Ken Robinson and this was the life that lay ahead of you. Of course, this is extraordinary for Ken, but in the times that he grew up, or I grew up, in a working class town in Lancashire, a small town called Accrington, it was also a time of the greatest social mobility, upward opportunity for working class children in a century, perhaps in not so spectacular a way as Ken. It was a time when children from modest circumstances could, through public education, great and inspiring teaching, have good, solid, middle-class contributing careers, have success and fulfillment in their lives because of the backing of a strong public education system, something that has been declining over the last 30 or 40 years in many ways, with movements for charter schools, academies, other kinds of organisations as well, declining funding in public education because of austerity. So Ken knew how important education was for him. And in books like this one, his most recent book, You, Your Child and School, really wanted not just the dream of you can be anyone you want to be, but a system of where everybody could be what they needed to be, because it had the power of support of strong teachers, of a teaching profession that worked together, was supported and not undermined by governments and bureaucracies. Imagine if, or as we'd say in the north of England, fancy that. And then imagine if you grow up with a disability. You contract a virus in a pandemic that's spreading around the world. And the result of it is you go into a special school. You wear braces made of iron on your legs in order to help you to walk. To find generations later that as well as, or instead of having braces on your legs, you are now having the steel sword of Her Majesty the Queen of England resting on your shoulders, to be benighted for your efforts and your contributions. Imagine if, despite this disability, you come to the view that this is not just a disability, but it is in some ways an asset or a gift, as Sir Ken often said. It's a gift because if you can no longer really fulfill your life through your body, be a soccer player perhaps like your brother or your father, that you can live a life of the mind. And I think now, today, in inclusive education, we do what Ken Robinson did, which is have a shift of perspective and say, what do you gain from what you have, as well as what do you lose from what you have? We've seen in Canada, for example, in our research on inclusive education in 10 of the school districts in the high-performing system of Ontario, that teachers teach children with learning disabilities about their disability. They teach them about famous people, accomplished people who share their disability. And they teach them to advocate for themselves inclusively in class with their teachers, helping them to understand what kinds of learning support, what kinds of teaching, what kinds of strategies are best for them in order to enable them to move forward. Imagine if, fancy that. And then imagine if you're not coached at school with the select group of students who might go on to Oxford and Cambridge after high school. Or imagine if you don't even go to a red brick university that might move you solidly into the professions, but you choose, as many working class students did in the 1960s, to go into teaching, into education through a college of education, a teacher's training college, as we called it at the time. Imagine if this lesser path should nonetheless lead you to go to the extraordinary teacher training college, Bretton Hall College in Yorkshire, established by a legend, an icon of child-centred, whole-child education, Sir Alec Clegg, Chief Education Officer for the largest school district at the time, the West Riding of Yorkshire. A man whose passions for the arts, for painting, led him not only to spread schools like this across the West Riding, mentor people who became directors and leaders of other systems across the country, attract visitors from all over the world, including the United States, to see England's extraordinary child-centred primary schools in the 1960s and 1970s. But also to bring you to a place that really cherished and valued the arts. This is what Sir Alec Clegg championed. This is why he established Bretton Hall College in the 1940s for people like Sir Ken Robinson, who most famously has embodied everything that it stood for, but for many other teachers of arts, drama, primary education, who took this path into helping children's learning across all the country and indeed many parts of the world. This college is now a sculpture park, celebrating the great sculptures carved out of northern millstone grit and polished from it by Henry Moore, Barbara Hepworth, and other great artists in Britain. Imagine if this should be your path, what you inherited from someone else. Imagine if, fancy that. And then imagine if you should find yourself by design, but partly by chance, to be not only a good speaker, like many keynote speakers are in education and other fields. In some ways, I'd claim to be one of them. But suddenly, in 18 minutes, do the most extraordinary combination of intellect, originality, moral purpose, emotional connection, life story, understanding of the work and the practice of schools and of teachers. And imagine if you should bring this all into an 18-minute talk that fought against the grain of many governments and bureaucracies over the last 30 or 40 years, with their emphasis on testing and hierarchy and bureaucracy and punishments and data and targets. But imagine if you could somehow capture this vision of what great learning and great teaching actually look like. And in 18 minutes, through the rest of your life, you would attract more than 70 million viewers, not only from education, but from the arts, from other fields as well. And that you will become a champion of an alternate, better, more humanistic vision of what learning and teaching was about. Imagine if, fancy that. And then imagine if one day, one of your old friends and colleagues and brothers in arms in education from the north of England also, who struggled with his own education. And by taking alternate paths and moving to different countries, just like Sir Ken Robinson, and working across different fields, just like Sir Ken Robinson. Not as spectacularly, but perhaps as significantly in terms of purpose and passion. Imagine if this person should come to you and say, Ken, I think I have no money. I have nobody behind me. I have no technology corporations. I have no philanthropists. But I have an idea that embodies everything you stand for. And that is to bring together a group of governments and their ministers from across the world, committed not just to testing, data, targets, hierarchy, competition, markets, but committed to a humanistic view of education and coaching each other about how to advance that around equality, broad excellence, democracy, inclusion, well-being, human rights. Imagine if I could bring these together, Ken, but I need somebody who believes all this too, and who all the world recognise and respect, and if they support it, and if they go with it, then they will all come. And this was the ARC Education Network that's now been going for 5 years. We meet in an annual summit. We have met virtually every 6 weeks during the pandemic to help ministers, teacher leaders, union leaders, senior civil servants think their way through the pandemic and protect the vulnerable and protect creativity and protect the public systems on which the chances for social mobility depend. And imagine if that person were Ken Robinson, who said, well, Andy, you know what? I'll commit in haste and repent at leisure. And Ken's support has been absolutely critical in this movement for a different, better, more inclusive kind of education across the world than many other governments and some organisations are promoting instead. Imagine if. Fancy that. So Ken's left us now, much too soon. There's so much to do. What has he left us? Well, he's left us with a great legacy, creativity, imagination, hundreds of thousands of teachers across the world carrying forward his work and his ideas. And he's left us, interestingly, at a time when all this, even before but especially after the pandemic, is coming to fruition. A time when we're thinking about reinvesting in public education again, building back better. A time when we're thinking of using the best of technology, not just technology for its own sake. A time when we're thinking of having more learning outdoors because that's what worked well with social distancing during the pandemic. He's left us when his time has come, and he's left us to do the work that his work brought to the world, and we, all of us, must now carry forward. This is a message in praise and in memory of Ken Robinson, friend, colleague, brother in arms, very much loved, always remembered.